Welcome to session 4 of Coping with COVID-19. And today we're going to be talking about isolation. I'm Gerry Vassar, President, CEO of Lakeside.
And I'm Diane Wagenhals, and I am the Program Director for Lakeside Global Institute.
Diane, one of the things that I'm hearing from people are some of the strange ideas behind isolation. That I don't think we've ever faced a time, at least in my lifetime, where we have felt so closed in. We've almost like forced agoraphobia, claustrophobia, or one of those phobias, where we're put in this place of being isolated.
Right.
And I think there's a whole new discovery process of what isolation feels like. Now we know, from therapeutic research that it's not good to feel isolated. People say, well, I feel very isolated. Some people feel isolated even in a culture of people because of some of the internal struggles they're having.
Right.
In this case, all of us have some sense of isolation from the normalcy of our life, or from some of the family members that we usually are accustomed to being with. So we're not working, we're isolating in different ways. And then we have all the other stressors that actually affect how we're feeling.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that's curious to me, we've talked about some of this COVID-19 impact being traumatizing to us, and that means it has effect on our brains, on our neuroscience. What does isolation do in this particular dynamic of COVID-19? I'm curious as to what your understanding of the effect of isolation, and maybe we can apply it directly to what we're facing each and every day as we're staying at home and isolating more, not able to go to work or school during this pandemic.
Yeah, isolation is one of those things. They actually use isolation as a form of punishment in prisons, which is actually very cruel. There's a little aside, but that isolating people creates a huge amount of loneliness, a feeling of, because one of the things all the neuroscience points to is that we are social beings.
Right.
We need our relationships. We need our connections. And basically, without the connections, it gets so bad that babies can die if they don't have those kinds of connections. So a really graphic illustration of that is what happened when there was some research done about infants and young children who were put in foundling homes in isolation because that was all that could be done. And do you know, I don't know if I ever told you this, do you know what the percentage of the children after a year or so, this was back in the 1800s, late 1800s, early 1900s, what percentage of children that were in that level of isolation died? Got a guess?
Probably larger than anyone would think. Tell us.
100%.
100% died.
Yeah.
Wow.
They didn't make it to the age of 2.
Didn't make it till the age of
And
2.
in the few places where they did survive, they figured out that these were kids that were allowed to go home maybe with one of the people who worked there and had a little bit of that kind of connection. Those were the only ones in the few places where that happened.
So there's an innate need to be a social creature, and if without that,
Yes.
we're not going to thrive.
Yes.
Okay. So as we move to the COVID issue, what's the impact for those of us who are adults and knowing that we have that innate need? What do we do? What's happening to
What's
us?
going on? And one of the things, one of the books that I've said relates to this, even though it was before the COVID thing, is Johan Hari's book, which is called Lost Connections. And he's a journalist, and you can even catch him on some podcasts. You just have to be careful. He has a lot of very flowery language, let's just say that. But he did a lot of research on what happens when we are disconnected as human beings. And so a quote from page 74, in his research, he discovered that feeling lonely, it turned out, caused your cortisol levels to absolutely soar.
And what does that mean?
So cortisol is a natural neurochemical that we have that when it's raised up and it's elevated, it actually stimulates everything inside. A little bit of it is really important, but when we have huge amounts over time, it has a way of causing a lot of stress on our whole body, physiologically and emotionally. It's like, it's a steroid. It just really it's like our own little opioid.
So those levels are elevated
Yes.
when we are isolated.
Yes.
That's what you're saying.
That's what this was, one of the disturbing things he says. Acute loneliness, the experiment found, was as stressful as experiencing a physical attack. Being deeply lonely seemed to cause as much stress as being punched by a stranger.
Wow, that's impressive.
Yeah, and so what's going on for us today, and so you may even feel like you've been punched, that you don't understand why you're hurting, why you can have physically hurting symptoms because you're so lonely. And fighting that, figuring out how to deal with it, especially if you know it's going to end, you can almost say, I can stand this if I only have to do this for another day or another week. But with no end in sight, how much desperation does that cause any of us to feel like I can't do this anymore? But I don't have a choice. I have to keep doing it. So that mindset, that realization that we have that this is going to go on, it seems, is also going to add to panic and anxiety and depression and all these negatives. Boy, this is negative. This is a really negative thought, but I think it's a truth too. I think it helps people. Maybe it explains why you might be feeling what you're feeling.
Right. So I'm also hearing the term connectedness. I'm seeing it in the title of the book.
Right.
And I'm thinking that there is some research he's focusing on about connectedness itself and its impact or lack thereof.
Sure. Yeah. The idea that in this book is that if we can regain our connections, we can recover from being disconnected.
Okay. Makes sense. That's logical.
Yeah, there we go. And being intentional about how to do that. And we're finding, I think one of the cool things about, I'm hoping it's happening all over the globe, but I think Americans are especially feisty about finding ways, once we realize there's a problem, that, all right, well, we get over the fact that we're going to be in this problem to thinking creatively, how do we get out of it? What is it that we're going to be able to do? Which is why people are using Zoom so much. Mm-hmm. And people are having like dinner parties and focusing on how are we all, and they're all separate, they're all in separate houses, but they're, toasting each other and things like that. That's promoting a sense that we still are in connection. We're doing trainings now using Zoom, and while it's not the same, people are feeling like you can project warmth, you can project caring.
So it's really important that we have those activities, social media, taking walks around the block, being safe distancing, but also talking to people.
Yes.
And working through how we keep connected to the people that are our loved ones.
Yeah.
Thankfully, we have FaceTime and Zoom and
Right.
those kinds of Facebook, social media vehicles where we can actually do that, which is years ago we couldn't.
No,
So that's an important part of how we cope with this.
I don't know how we would have coped with this if we didn't have
Right.
the technology we have today. I can't
Right.
imagine
Right.
what it would be like.
So it's interesting that part of the isolation factor is this lost connectedness that we have and being socially and innate, socially needing some connections. Not having it creates a physiological response.
Absolutely.
That can be leading to not only a sense of cortisol, heightened levels of cortisol, but also emotions that go with that.
Yes.
Depression, anxiety,
Yes.
and those kinds of things that we can kind of expect if we're isolated.
And he's saying that when he did his research, it's the loneliness factor that leads to so many things that are the problems that we are facing, all the different ailments in our society, not all of them, but many of them. If you trace it back, it's going to come back to that.
Which is that loneliness is kind of exaggerated now for many people, particularly if they are isolated. I know some people who live alone, and that makes it very difficult when they're out of their normal routine, disoriented from life,
Right.
and totally isolated.
That's why you need pets sometimes. If you can't.
Dogs help. Yep, dogs and cats and pets help.
Yep.
Well, fascinating information to think about that it's a physiological response that we have with isolation. And I think we can close this session with that understanding. I think maybe the next thing we'll do is talk a little bit about social distancing.
Sure.
And talk about the impact of that. And I want to thank you for joining this session of Coping with COVID-19, particularly related to isolation.